Hi, welcome to Version Up. My name is Kai Rosga. My guest today is Julian Gilson, founder of IntensifAI, which advises law firms on AI transformation. We set out to answer a question: what are the fundamental building blocks for becoming an AI native law firm? Julian brings to the conversation a product management background, and it shows. He breaks the problem into three layers: people, process, and tech, and walks through what it means to build out the infrastructure for an AI transformation at a traditional law firm. But law firms are not technology companies, so this means overcoming some major challenges when building on top of legacy IT systems and tools, legacy mindsets, and legacy business models. I thought the conversation was a great starting point for a topic I've been really interested in exploring on the pod. So let's get into it. Hi, Julian. Welcome to Version Up.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Always enjoy speaking to people more astute on the technical side of things. So we have a kind of legal generalist audience, but I think they're interested in some of the more technical aspects of how you achieve AI enablement. So if it's okay with you, I would love to explore some of that today.
Oh, that'd be great. I love my legal fans, and I've built my career around translating the business value to technical value and then back.
That's a challenge. And I think but a very important skill and value, I think, at this moment in time where lawyers are trying to understand technology in a different way and understand not just how it helps them do their practice, but also how it impacts their business, what kind of investments they have to make, et cetera. One way I thought we could kick off the conversation is to talk about a concept all of us are hearing more and more about, which is the AI native law firm. So this could be a law firm that's transitioning to being more AI native or AI forward, or it can be a startup, a
Mhm.
boutique that opens up, spins off from a traditional law firm. Let's first focus on more traditional law firms that are transitioning from a tech stack that, we probably a lot of us are familiar with who have worked at law firms over to something more prepared for the AI digital transformation. What is your view on what is an AI native law firm in that context? And what exactly are the investments or decisions that have to be made by a law firm to go AI native?
Good question. So, become an AI native law firm. Three different heuristics to build that on would be to, build workflows designed around, AI and human kind of handoffs. AI does one aspect of a workflow, human reviews it. AI does another aspect of a workflow, human reviews it, etc. You humans are still made to be kind of that judgment layer always. And I think that's kind of a rather, one thing to not lose, don't lose that subject matter expertise. Data. How is your data quality? How is your data completeness? Are you keeping data all in the same format? Because a human will, rely on different types of data to really kind of search for the right document, for example, that they necessarily need. An AI tool you're using will need the same kind of setup. So I think that's particularly something very important to do. And digitalization, ultimately digitalization. You'd still be surprised within kind of this, within law firms or even other kind of other organizations to what is still not consistently digitized or kind of standardized even. So I would say those probably three
Interesting.
things are still rather fundamental to become an AI native law firm.
Can we take those in reverse? Because you
Mm.
surprised me with the last one, but very interesting. What things would you expect to be digitalized if you were working in another sector that if you landed in a law firm as a technologist, you'd be surprised
Mhm.
to see is not digitalized at a law firm?
I'm kind of surprised about how much is still managed by phone and maybe not even transcribed. That was one thing that kind of like surprised me. That maybe another sector. Yeah, I would say that's one probably main example I'd go after.
How about internal meetings?
Oh, absolutely.
Lawyers do a lot of internal team meetings. I'm sure there is more and more of this being done now, but there's a lot of probably strategic thinking and content buried in those meetings and
There
captured.
is absolutely. There's also a compliance aspect of this as well. I think a lot of regulated firms, they don't necessarily like, for certain reasons, they don't like every single conversation they have being recorded. And you kind of really, this is also where point you have to balance what is possible versus what is desirable. And I think there's still business value to recording even a fraction of your meetings and transcribing them, automatically pipelining them to your CRM, for example, or even kind of, some other tool you might be using to manage client communications or just even your own kind of internal case management, et cetera. And even if you're just capturing a fraction of that, and that's the only kind of like a low risk fraction you can capture, that's still value you can have to your law firm.
If you're on, for example, the 365 Enterprise Suite, you have to turn off a lot of defaults to not be digitalizing everything that you're doing. So, I think for better, for worse, we're being nudged, pushed, handheld along that path to really digitize what we're doing. So let's say we are to the point where most of our work is being done in some digital way. It's all being captured by our IT
Mhm.
systems. Okay, you've got all this data, right? This is the other of the three prongs you brought up. Walk me through that prong, the data prong. What is the main challenge that law firms face who are thinking about deploying AI when it comes to their data?
I would say probably data completeness. So just because there's a data field set up does not mean it is consistently captured. That's another field of data hygiene, but just even data completeness. Are you capturing it? So that's one thing you kind of run into. If you're using an AI to kind of sort through a bunch of matters, for example, that AI is going to do one particular search and identify, okay, what are the metadata fields of these particular documents? And then after it identifies those metadata fields, then it'll go into the actual content. So I would say that completeness, I would say consistency as well. Maybe you are capturing metadata, but it's all kind of human input fields rather than something standardized. Maybe you have a data field, there should be maybe 10 or 15 different values of it, but no, everyone's kind of inputting their own particular value. That's not scalable. It can't, not sortable. If you're using an AI system and maybe that AI system is developing, a query, it's querying your data based off some query language. It's going to have a very hard time with this. You're not going to get very good outcomes for that. So I would say, completeness, I would say the reliability and the standardization of it too.
And even if you get one practice group of a law firm on board, you may run into issues if another practice is not being consistent or complete in their approach to inputting the data. So yeah, no, definitely a big challenge. And so what is the way that a law firm addresses this? Is this the kind of thing where you
Mhm.
hire a consultant to come in and clean your data or like a legal tech service provider?
Oh,
Is this more of like a internal hire capacity? You're going to spend 2, 3 years, cleaning up your data and putting in place new protocols, et cetera?
well, historically, yes, that was the approach. Kind of, yeah. It's not atypical. And I'm not talking about just law firms here, but other firms, they'll hire external consultants with a lot of data science, maybe data management capacity or experience. And they would be able to kind of, organize data on their behalf, kind of even more in a technical way rather than just kind of a project management level. What I would say is different now, and it's a method I'm experimenting with, is actually you know, using AI to develop metadata fields, make sure those are kind of managed, et cetera. So you can actually, when you submit new information, create a new matter, that's one kind of like new experimental method where I'm kind of playing around with. Pretty good, pretty good. I think that's it'll definitely helps you save some money on hiring extra consultants for these particular large scale projects. On one end, historically, this has been a very expensive problem. Very expensive, but foundational problem that not everyone understood why they needed to spend money on it, data quality. But also increasingly, it's something you can just build into your process too. And, just even AI makes it so cheap and automatic to do.
I see. So if you are a typical law firm and you're trying to get your house in order because you want to embark on a sort of AI transformation, what would be the steps for like hiring someone or internally for diagnosing your current systems and determining how adequate they are, where the gaps are, and how long would it
All
take?
right. So I like to think of this as three different buckets: people, process, technology. And now those are, I think, the ways you should think about not just a law firm, but any particular organization. Do you have the prerequisite people to make this kind of AI transformation work? That's things like, internal champions, culture, make sure your leadership is open-minded to it, or, there's who's gonna argue against this particular transformation, et cetera. There's technology, which we just spoke about. I would put those particular data quality, making sure your tools are integrated. That's another thing I can I would really hound people on making sure you might have 12 or 15 different IT systems in your whole organization. Are they integratable to each other? Are they siloed systems? That's a big thing when it comes to technology. But full kind of tech. Those are probably some of the biggest technical gaps. And then there's process. I like to kind of think of it like this: if you onboarded someone new to your new to your team today, how easy would it be for them to pick up what you do? If it's easy, then okay, you might have a pretty well set up process, and that kind of needs to be institutionalized. If not, you may not have the prerequisite processes in place for AI. AI is really good at workflows that are well defined. So I kind of want everyone to think in terms of technology, people, process. Those all prongs need to be in place for an AI, and there are kind of different gaps that could exist within them.
On the technology side, I've heard many times people mention this issue of integration, whether systems can talk to each other, whether they operate in a silo, as you put it. Can you walk me through in a little more detail what that looks like? Like what kind of systems at a law firm or legal enterprise need to be talking to each other?
So I would say, just for our example, you're probably, for many law firms, they're probably operating with a document management system. This is kind of the single source of truth for documents. It is auditable, version controlled, all that good stuff. They should have a some sort of time and billing management, practice management rather, something sort of practice management system, depending on, how big of a law firm, how big and how many practice areas. That just describes how complex it is. And you're probably having just a basic workflow Microsoft 365 suite, basic workflow tool, all of that. So just starting with those.
Like Power Automate
Yes,
and all
Power
that?
Automate, but anything built on top.
Yeah.
You have your Microsoft, they have anything built on top of that too. Or it's part of that suite. Power
Yeah.
Automate's a really good example. Those should, increasingly, they are being able to be integrated with each other. I think that, integrations before this AI era kind of meant more API integrations. There might be some workflows you can probably kind of incorporate between each other, all based off that API. Now with MCP servers, which everyone's kind of, mixed reviews about. Some people really like them, some people really don't. With MCP servers, I think that's kind of one way these particular tools can talk to each other even better, because it allows humans, not just, computer language, to instigate workflows across them.
So how much are we dependent on the vendors to make their products interoperable as opposed to being able to engage in self as users to make those systems talk to each other?
Great question. I think it's in the first 2 years of this AI boom, we were kind of dependent more on users to do that. I think increasingly, just for for the sake of safety, for the sake of security, for the sake of reliability, we should be depending on vendors to do so. Because just in our MCP server example, you should always rather depend on the MCP server from the vendor itself, rather than one you find online, or maybe one you build yourself, because that MCP server will be more secure, it'll be more reliable, and you'll have to change that yourself when something on the underlying system changes. So it is better to depend on the vendor because they are a tech company. Because one of the meta narratives I kind of try to push on these law firms is like, if you're not already a tech company, it's going to be a hard time for you to convert to being a tech company now. I'm not saying it's impossible, but if you're not already a tech company, then in this AI era, don't try to build something new. Try to always rely on the tech stack you already have, the vendors you already have, etc. I know a lot of larger law firms have their own innovation offices. They really want to build out their own tech stack. A lot of firms have been marketed to this last few years, kind of bought by custom software development companies. And one outcome of this is that there's a lot of software that was built, much of it was probably just AI wrappers upon foundation models. And those law firms did not have the infrastructure or the people, process, technology to really manage that custom software long term. So I think at this stage, if you're not already a tech company, rely on the vendor.
So what if you have certain systems you want to connect to and the vendor, for whatever reason,
Don't yet.
hasn't offered that openness yet? Maybe it's a business model question for them. Maybe they're just slow. I don't know. So you have some self-help options, it sounds like, but those self-help options for achieving that connectivity come with what downsides? Security, what else?
So security and reliability are the bigger ones. Simply like, with something on the underlying system changes, your own system has to change its response to it. And you're not always going to be notified about those underlying changes. Back, when, I call it the API era. We're still in the API era. We're connecting tools via APIs. That was always a big kind of problem. Like you constantly had to be, if you were building a system, that system relied on someone else's API. You constantly had to pay attention to changes in their product and when they were going to release that. And it was always a crisis when one day there was a change to underlying data feature you were reliant on. And then you weren't prepared for that. Your own system goes down. So I would say those are probably the big ones I can think of at the moment. And can you manage? Yeah, do you have your own tech skills to manage? Do you have your own tech capabilities to manage this long term? I've even had some clients say, "Hey, we want to build a system. We want to based off our own firm's knowledge, build out our own AI tool and then market it to other companies." And I've got to market it to other law firms, for example. And I'm like, okay, well, those other law firms, they're going to expect a whole alphabet soup of compliance certificates. Are you going to be able to maintain that? That's something big tech companies can do, for example. Is that something you can do? So things like that. Like I think you really do have to build out your own tech. If you are a large firm, at least you'll build out your own kind of tech department if you really want to build and manage these things long-term in a professional way. If you are solo and smaller, this is kind of less of a risk. I will say, okay, you still should have some, technical capabilities to do this and understand what you're actually building. But, the risk might just be a little bit lower simply because the scale you're working on is a little bit lower, and you might even be more agile to respond to changes more quickly.
But if you were a larger corporate law firm, multi-practice group law firm, and you were really wanted to go full bore with this AI native transition, and you did have this vision of building your own automations, really wrangling all your data together to make sure you're maximizing the value you can extract from it. And sure, eventually you have some ideas that you think maybe you could even productize in some sense. What is the sort of internal capacity you would need to pull that off? What is the infrastructure you would need to build out to pull that off?
Good question. I would say my initial thinking is that it's more than just having an innovation office. It's more than having an innovation office and more than just having like a CTO in charge. Many of the CTOs at these firms, the more CTOs that kind of act like managed service providers. You're buying technology, you're governing that technology, you're kind of helping users kind of on their day-to-day needs of it, maybe doing some data migrations, etc. You need a CTO, a technology department that is more in line with what a tech company would have. A CTO that's building, not just managing. And that's going to be, a CTO from a technology company ultimately. And that's probably, I think, one of the strongest prerequisites because that will provide your leadership. You need to have a full team of kind of devs. And I would say even a culture change. These tech companies and these technological transformations, they rely on a culture of experimentation that your legacy organization probably doesn't have. Tech companies have these mantras where they have permission to fail, permission to experiment. It is not considered that big of a deal if you fail and you fail quick. This is a big culture change to law firms. They do not have this. And basically the culture set up to be almost the opposite. So you CTO and often like a leadership team that can manage that cultural change. I would say it's something probably that like a big and that probably undercounted as well. You don't want, for example, like these practice areas, maybe you're building a tool out be used for these practice areas. These practice areas are actually very conservative. And then you kind of, from those practice areas launch it to from the internal use, you're going to launch it to other teams as other, external use as well. Sell it essentially. That is that is such a large culture change. I think is sometimes undercounted. And you could have, and as a large corporate law firm, you're going to have a lot of resistance.
Yeah. And I would never want to wave my hand at that issue. I think that would be a huge barrier for any law firm to take that cultural shift. I think maybe that could be partially achieved, like you said, through new leadership, but also maybe by creating a separate unit or division with their own P&L,
Yeah.
their own accountability to management. So, maybe you could chip away at that. But staying for a moment on the technical piece of it, you mentioned you would have a CTO who knows how to build, not just sell, you said. And then you would have a team of devs. You've been in product management. What does that team of devs look like? Who's on that team? Is it AI scientists, data scientists? Is it, software engineers? Who's the
At the
dream team?
core of it. Oh, the dream team.
Yeah.
I would say, so I'm going to give one answer, then I'm going to give a caveat. So, okay, you have, just your senior devs, you have a back-end team, a front-end team usually. You have development operation, DevOps, development operations. They're kind of managing, okay, what's a platform that these devs are using? Data scientists and AI. So data scientists, yeah, probably, but data science team, sometimes the data science team is separate from the devs. Sometimes they are together with the devs, depends on how you want to set it up. What are you building really? I would, an AI engineer, yeah, I could say that. I could see that. I think that's kind of a growing, like emerging field, kind of those who are particularly building AI, tools themselves. Yeah, that's probably rather good. If you're using cloud architecture, maybe even like a cloud architecture team. There's so many different, so many different titles and different teams you could have. It all kind of depends on what are you building? How is it going to be set up? I'm sure everyone's going to have their own particular, formula for that. My caveat is that just like how, the legal field is projected, is changing and projected to change because of AI, the software development field has already changed with it. You need far fewer people to develop software than you did before. And the entry level people you were kind of dependent on are they're having a hard time getting hired because senior devs are enabled with tools like Claude Code, for example, that can really kind of just augment what they can really do. So it's really kind of an opportunity to kind of take advantage of those new tools, make your team even more nimble.
So let's say you want to start really small and agile and you want to really see how this is going, right? You're a law firm that wants to dip your toes in this concept, but doesn't want to go all in yet. Is there an opportunity here to outsource some of those pieces on a part-time basis, or would that be foolish because you really want to have like a dedicated team on these core functions?
Let me think.
And let me add to that while you're thinking. There's also a lot of legal tech vendors that I have seen originate as products, but now look a lot more like services. And they are offering the ability to help law firms build automations, to deploy agents, et cetera. Add that to the mix as well. Can you use all these external providers and mix it together and have a few people internally on that tech team? Or do you think that you really need to bring as much of this in-house as possible for it to work?
Good question. You've hit on a lot of points, actually. So I think last year we kind of started seeing a shift within kind of this AI field. Before last year, we were applying kind of the SaaS playbook to AI. So there were going to be, like, we're developing a lot of, now they're kind of derogatorily termed AI wrappers, but they were just like tools built on the foundation models. They acted basically like software, essentially. And I think last year we saw the switch more to forward deployed engineering. It's going to be, in the long term, it's probably not going to bet too much money on it, but probably, it's going to be the foundation models that really win. And the real key with any organization to AI, success versus AI failure is that last mile. That's usually filled by those forward deployed engineers. And they're experts in the AI tools and the foundation models and kind of all the tool sets built around them. They're experts in your operations, and they're the ones building out. And almost their role is almost even less engineer and almost more project manager. Almost more like that. And it's almost more about kind of organizations and et cetera, not even as technical. I think over time, this position, forward deployed X, is going to be less technical and more human and organizational management. I'll bet a bit more money on that point. But to tie that back to your own AI transformation, I would say, yeah, at this stage, what I predict is like, yeah, use those foundation models, those foundation tools, such as Claude, for example, Claude, and use that as a basis for your own AI transformation. Is it a good idea? So if you really want to become an AI native law firm, what kind of vendors and services do you use? I would say, okay, yeah, use the start off with that regular platform. As I said before, if you're not already a tech company, don't try to build something yet. However, you can build, automations, tools built on top of those platforms. I think it's safe to say that some of those foundation models might win the race. They'll be with us going forward. I'll bet a little bit less money on that one, though. You never know about the confidence of that. You never know what happens in the future. But yeah, use that foundation tool, buy that, hire a service, hire service company, or, even maybe in-house, maybe not yet. Start with contractors, build on top of those. Once you're confident that you're, making this full AI native transition, then hire in-house and build that internally. That's what I've probably kind of recommend.
I like that. That's a really good tip. And where would you put into this conversation the idea that if you're building those automations using forward deployed engineers by a legal tech platform, legal tech vendor, versus creating your own tech stack internally to build those automations on your own system and not be in any way kind of locked in or dependent on the vendor? If you imagine those two paths for a law firm, what are the pluses and minuses of taking one sort of more vendor dependent path versus a vendor agnostic path?
On that vendor dependent path, you're creating a partnership almost. And that vendor, who might be very well funded, is going to invest in your partnership. And I think it's not, that is itself is a benefit. However, you're also locked in. It's a gamble. You don't know what the future's, as we said, we don't know what the future beholds. If you're, using services that are less vendor dependent, you're maybe using, a team of consultants, a dev shop, for example, and they're helping you build out something internally. Yeah, okay, I would say you get a little bit less of that initial investment up front, and you're more dependent on your own skill set and your own knowledge, for example. So I bring it to you like this way. Okay, you're a non-technical lawyer. Maybe you're very good at your subject matter expertise, but those aren't technical. You're bringing on a dev shop to build you something, and they're going to come to you and they'll be like, okay, here they're going to do a handoff at first, and they'll say, okay, here's how you log into the cloud service provider, do X, Y, and Z. Here's another provider you have to log, another tool we built, do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you have to pay them to manage it long term, for example. Do you have that prerequisite knowledge to be able to manage that software that is built for you, and not maybe has some sort of admin UI, for example, maybe not. All it depends on what's being built. So it's much higher upfront cost in knowledge and learning, your time, and probably your resources as well. Maybe they built, maybe the tools they used or the underlying tech stack is cheaper than what the first example was. But you're going to have to maintain that long term, and you had to pay someone else to kind of build it out for you. So I don't know if it necessarily works out long term. And maybe it depends on how confident are you to become, a part-time CTO. I feel that way.
It's a really well put. I think the question law firms have to ask themselves is, how committed are we? How committed is our leadership to this? Because if you just go in, don't go all out, then you could end up spending a lot of money and not having the results that you expect or want. The list you provided was interesting. So on the vendor dependent route, the maintenance and upkeep is easier for sure, right? The costs probably lower upfront for sure. Maybe over the long term, it's even lower. But you added another benefit, which I hadn't thought about before. I had always thought about how these vendors are learning from their clients, from the law firms, right? The law firms are helping the vendors learn what are the needs that a law firm has, what things need to be automated, what are the legal workflows that are really valuable to automate, et cetera. I hadn't thought about it going the other way, which is if you're a law firm, especially if you are just starting on this digital transformation path, you may actually learn from the vendor, right? If you start using a vendor to build in workflow automation, for example, or deploy agentic AI in your organization, you actually might have a period of time there where you're learning from the vendor what the possibilities are for this space and what the frontier looks like.
Yeah. You might be learning from them,
Yeah.
and they might even just be investing in you. Depends on what your relationship is with them, of course. If you're if you're a smaller level law firm, okay, maybe they're not going to invest in you as much. But if you're bigger, they might be able to build things out with you, and for you. And which might actually be very expensive in true absolute terms. But you might be insulated from the cost from that simply because, okay, we're building out this workflow, this automation for one of our clients. This could be strategic for us. And granted, you have to think about long term, like how is it strategic for them? Are they going to just be kind of taking this, kind of scaling it, et cetera? It's no longer strategic for you. It's a give and take for sure. Depends depends on our predictions. Are these large legal tech companies going to try to replace law firms in the future? Are they going to try to and they augment law firms in the future? So I think we can all have our predispositions on what we think about it, but I think it's still up in the air.
I think personally that in the medium to long term, there is a potentially significant risk to law firms. But from this conversation, I feel a little more comforted that for those law firms that are smart about it, they can actually view these products as training wheels and give themselves some optionality for eventually building out an internal capacity to host these things locally, build them internally. Now, I think it's too easy to become dependent. It's like, if you try to teach a 3-year-old how to ride a bike and you give them training wheels, sometimes it can take a long time to get those training wheels off because the child gets used to it. As opposed to if you don't give them the training wheel, it's a little tougher in the beginning, they fall a little more. But once they get it, right? And they're good without the training wheels. So law firms have to be really smart about how to deploy it. But I do walk away with this conversation a little more encouraged that there's a path where maybe you have these legal tech products that you use in the short term, but you can sort of get off of them if you need to or want to. And maybe not for everything you do, but maybe for core strategic work that you do.
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely like one option. Going to use them I like that analogy. Use them as training wheels for your own kind of, tech stack that you might be developing later. And it helps your team kind of helps your firm build that institutional knowledge. Okay, what does it take to really build out and manage technology? And move from that service mindset to that software as a service mindset.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's go with the approach where you're building from scratch as an AI native law firm. For example, maybe you are a rainmaking partner at a big corporate law firm and you decide to go out on your own, start a boutique practice. You bring maybe a few people with you, but you plan to really build that boutique practice on top of technology instead of people. So we've sort of talked about the infrastructure from a person perspective. We talked about the people you would need. We talked about the culture you would need to instill. What about the tech stack? If you're starting from scratch, you're able to really just build a law firm from scratch today. Can you frame out for me what that tech stack would look like if you wanted to optimize for automations and leveraging AI and delivering client services with technology, et cetera?
Okay. Start off in the cloud, choose a good cloud provider, choose a good AI layer, such as Anthropic or something. And then from there, you really have so many options to build, with those cloud tools, so many options to build out workflows that are going to be automatable, auditable, and everything like that. I would say you start with the cloud provider layer, whether, that be Google Cloud, whether that be AWS, whether that be Azure, and then build, your AI layer on top of that. And you're really just truly at that point, just building software. You're building software. And I think that's kind of where most, software providers really kind of begin. They start with that infrastructure, and that's where you begin.
What if on the client's delivery, the services delivery side, if you were wanting to really lean into technology as a way to deliver client services where your client can interact with you outside of just emails and Teams and calls, et cetera, would that be with the cloud service provider or would you need to add in some other bespoke solutions to
You
pull
can
that
build
off?
2 options. You can build it on top when it comes to that, service to delivery level, you can definitely build it on top of the cloud service provider. I think if you're really taking that philosophy where you want everything built in house, you can, and you maybe should. It's a good way to keep it secure. I wouldn't, in your early stages, I wouldn't stress just, I wouldn't avoid buying it out as well. I like to think of, I think of it this way. One guiding philosophy is that no one wants another UI. So automate as much as possible. And that in that case, yeah, it's just automating your built on the cloud layer. And basically there's one layer that the end user sees, maybe one layer that your human in the loop sees, and then one layer that, your developers see, but that's kind of a little bit different layer. They're not a user, they're a builder.
Yeah.
And you can kind of, they can see many
Yeah.
different UIs.
And then we're on the cloud, but is there a version of this where you want some things on-prem? Like, is that part of the
Hybrid
strategy?
strategy. Yeah, that's definitely, something that can be, that might be desirable if you have particular types of data you don't want to share there. If a particular type of risk you don't want to, move there necessarily, like, you can definitely keep some data on-prem, and then, yeah, I would say so. I would keep it high. I wouldn't say just on-prem. I would say hybrid, because definitely some functions or workflows you're going to want to keep on one of those basic cloud providers as well, because you don't want to build your entire infrastructure. No,
Yeah, for maintenance and upkeep and all
exactly,
that, right?
exactly. And
Yeah.
then client delivery, for example.
Right. Very interesting. Fascinating conversation. Thank you,
Thank you.
Julian. Do you want to give us your pitch? What do where can we find you? How can we take advantage of your
Sure thing.
expertise?
I'm Intensify. We help law firms, in their AI transformation end to end. So everything from that initial kind of training enablement to building out those back end workflows with agents, for example. So, come find me at like intensify.tech. Come find me on Julian Gilson on LinkedIn. And yeah, just come find me there, and we meet you where you are, and we take you to where you want to be. And we always start with kind of seeing, okay, what's the reality on the ground? Where can we actually take your particular operation and then put you on a roadmap, get you running there. So we do not just not just the strategy, but also implementation.
And if we want to meet you IRL, we'll find you in DC?
In Washington, D.C., yes.
Excellent. Okay. Not too far from me. Thank you, Julian, for your time. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much. Highly appreciate it.